Commenting on Dr. Cohen's talk is Professor Dianne Stewart of the Department of Religion at Emory University. Professor Stewart is an expert on the theologies and religious practices of the African diaspora and of African-derived religions in the Americas, with a particular focus on Black, womanist, and Caribbean liberationist theologies. She's the author of 3 Eyes for the Journey, African Dimensions of the Jamaican Religious Experience, which appeared in 2005 with Oxford University Press. And she's near completion of her 2nd book, based on 5 years of research in Trinidad and Tobago. Bringing Down the Power, 4 Centuries of African Religion in Trinidad, From Nationalism to Womanism, examines the history and historiography of African, especially Yoruba and Orisha religious traditions, from the arrival of Africans during the colonial period to the emergence of women as the chief architects of the Orisha movement and of its impact on civic life and social formation in contemporary Trinidad. Professor Stewart.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor McCauley, and to the organizers from the AAR for inviting me to participate in this video conference today. And thank you, Dr. Cohen, for your wonderful presentation. I recently became interested in cognitive science of religion research for one chief reason. It offered compelling resources to consider novel approaches to the study of African continental and African Atlantic religions. CSR actually provided some of the ammunition needed to confront the historical and residual problems so-called savage thinkers have posed for scholars of religion. Most disconcerting for me was how religious taxonomies that emerged from guiding assumptions about the mental capacities of savage and civilized societies in the history of religion's canon encourage flawed and inadequate theoretical treatments of African religious cultures, especially their so-called animist, magical, and superstitious features. While political correctness and a genuine sensitivity to the limited conceptual paradigms structuring expert knowledge in the study of global religions certainly temper the claims and judgments scholars might make today about African religious cultures, the field is no less plagued by the discursive power of the history of ideas. In that cognitive science makes it possible to speak of the history of ideas in biological terms that support more balanced approaches and frameworks in anthropological, phenomenological, and theological comparisons of religions, it seemed to me a promising conceptual location for exploring a plethora of questions about the universal and local features of African religious cultures and their transmission among communities of African descent in the Atlantic world. I did not leave my initial encounters with CSR, and they are very brief, by the way, with CSR scholarship convinced that this new scientific approach offered the most credible and comprehensive solutions to the scholarly quest to understand religion or religious experience. However, I did find CSR's focus on invisible sources of strategic knowledge and agency of substantial worth to the kind of theological and phenomenological themes most relevant to my research agenda of providing a more rich and credible account of enduring African-derived religions and religious practices, especially in Caribbean and American contexts where their influence is thought to be least apparent. I was particularly concerned about how we might understand the dynamic and persistent features of the so-called magical or superstitious dimensions of African Atlantic religious culture, which in some cases, especially in regions characterized by Protestant heritages, emerged as the most salient and widespread African spiritual customs that have been preserved over time. I am speaking of traditions most conventionally referenced by generic appellations such as conjure and hoodoo in the United States and obeah in the Anglophone Caribbean, where invisible sources of revelation and agency are assumed to be prolific in the absence of any standard devotional practices oriented toward a central divine being or community of divine beings. Cognitive scientific studies of the modern brain are of immense value to the theoretical turn I am attempting to take in my approach to African religious studies, and Obeah studies in particular, for what they tell us about universal human cognition invites prudent reflection upon the cultural and ideological constructs governing our appreciation of human commonalities and differences. With an awareness that all contemporary humans came from a shared anatomically modern human AMH ancestral lineage, and that the latest modifications in brain development did not happen among one segment of the AMH population situated in Europe, but occurred tens of thousands of years ago across the entire AMH global population, we have the scientific license to theorize about our common religious proclivities as a human race in productive ways that, as Dr. Cohen suggests, might capitalize upon the best instincts of problematic pioneers like Edward Tyler. In his remarks about ethnography and the science of culture, Tyler specified that, and I'm quoting, "It appears both possible and desirable to eliminate considerations of hereditary varieties of races of man, and to treat mankind as homogeneous in nature, though placed in different grades of civilization." CSR updates and adds credible scientific weight to Tyler's belief that, and I further quote, "Even when it comes to comparing barbarous hordes with civilized nations, the consideration thrusts itself upon our minds how far item after item of the life of the lower races passes into analogous proceedings of the higher, in forms not too far changed to be recognized, and sometimes hardly changed at all. If we choose out in this way things which have altered little in a long course of centuries, we may draw a picture where there shall be scarce a hand's breadth difference between an English plowman and a Negro of Central Africa." Perhaps beyond anything Tyler could have envisioned, Dr. Cohen's scholarship pioneers his new point of departure in African Atlantic religious studies, while contributing immensely to social scientific approaches to the study of religion. Her developing research agenda, as presented here today, illustrates one of the potentially corrective advantages of CSR approaches to religious and cultural comparison, limiting, if not eliminating, the ideological purchase the category of the primitive holds over research involving persons, groups, societies, and practices hitherto so classified. CSR levels the playing field in such a way that since the emergence of anatomically modern humans around 100,000 years ago, cognitively speaking, we are either all primitives or all moderns. Dr. Cohen thus approaches her research on spirit possession among Afro-Brazilians from the premise that the phenomenon under investigation is not an abnormal or pathological invention of savage minds, but a universal phenomenon observed across diverse global contexts. And she employs cognitive scientific theories to offer alternative explanations for why spirit possession rituals might be more widespread when particular environmental and historical circumstances prevail. In complementing these research findings with current studies of UK students' perceptions of comparable embodied experiences, she makes good use of CSR research to suggest alternative explanations for spirit possession rituals that actually correspond with the emic interpretations of practitioners in a religious context and non-practitioners in a secular context. As a result, she makes a compelling case for why scholarly treatments of religious experience must come to terms with how participants understand and interpret their experiences. From the way she tells it, I gather that Dr. Cohen entered the field prepared to reckon with indigenous theories of religious experience and thus received participants' displacement model of possession as an instructive foundation for developing a comparative research agenda. one that promises to enrich our awareness of the cognitive mechanisms at work in possession rituals and participants' intuitive and reflective understandings of such rituals. Her research speaks to the respectable coherence between cultural anthropology and cognitive science, and I wonder whether the same could be said about theological studies in cognitive science with respect to spirit possession. Although my work on African Atlantic religious traditions led me to identify spirit possession as one of 6 major features characterizing African-derived religions such as Jamaican Kumina, Haitian Voodoo, and Trinidadian Orisha, I approached spirit possession from a theological perspective. Apart from the fact that my focus upon liberation theology and African retentions encompassed a different scholarly agenda than that of the typical social scientist, I found conventional social scientific explanations for spirit possession generally unconvincing, irrelevant, or simply off-putting. As I read about Dr. Cohen's findings, I could relate now to the displacement model of possession on a personal and scholarly level. I feel pretty certain that the displacement understanding of possession is the only model I can recall ever encountering as a participant in and witness to numerous spirit manifestation rituals, both growing up in and studying African American and Caribbean religious contexts where they are standard practice. From a theological standpoint, spirit possession rituals have been and continue to be a principal means by which many African and African Atlantic communities access divine revelation. And it is important to keep in mind the manner in which revelation in many such contexts holistically encompasses what has come to characterize discrete areas of knowledge in the post-Enlightenment West. Conventional approaches to disciplinary, even interdisciplinary knowledge acquisition in the Western Academy do not readily encourage transdisciplinary pedagogical strategies that allow students of African religions to apprehend the complexity and comprehensiveness of theoretical and practical knowledges that are discerned through revelatory experiences in African religious cultures. Revelation is reason, is science, and is technology in, for example, African Indigenous Churches, or AICs. It follows then that AICs would emerge to compensate for the deficiencies of the colonial church that socialized African converts to compartmentalize their lives with the expectation that the church's mission was to attend to interior issues of soul salvation. This was never the way religion or revelation worked in African contexts. And with the colonial disruption of indigenous structures pertaining to health and healing, education, social governance, and modes of production, revelation via the presence of divine or invisible agents with the best strategic knowledge would have to remain a salient and pervasive phenomenon in African religious cultures. The same point could be made for African Atlantic contexts of chattel slavery and racial oppression. In the aftermath of slavery in the United States during the late 1800s, a serious theological contention emerged between educated African American evangelists and the untutored ex-slaves they sought to incorporate into the official Christian communion of their independent black churches. While the former appealed to a high Christology and insisted upon dogmatic standards of faith confession, the latter privileged pneumatology and clung to Africanized rituals like the ring shout that invoked divine presence through spirit possession. As I read through first-hand testimonies pertaining to ring shout rituals, I cannot say for certain that participants always interpreted divine visitations through a displacement model, but displacement ideas are implicit in their reflections upon the personal and social significance of divine authority, agency, and what CSR would call strategic knowledge, untainted by any fusion with the diminished human capacities of a given host. Revelation in these and other African and African Atlantic contexts is a recurring and contiguous event that participants appear to accept as authoritative on the basis that it is supplied by gods, ancestors, or other revered invisible agents who have full access to strategic knowledge and thus solutions to personal and social affliction. In my view, the displacement model of spirit manifestation offers the necessary preconditions for revelation to signify all that it does in African and African Atlantic religious cultures. And if future CSR research conclusively shows that humans are cognitively predisposed to conceive of spirit possession through a displacement model, I would expect that theologians of African and African Atlantic religions could benefit tremendously from such insight. CSR research already indicates that despite the apparatuses in place to reinforce the persuasive power of orthodox theological indoctrination, as Dr. Cohen puts it, and I'm quoting, intuitive defaults may be hard to override. This CSR discovery is not inconsequential for theological scholars, especially those engaged in liberation or contextual theologies that claim to privilege indigenous thought systems and epistemologies of oppressed communities in their approaches. There is a greater tendency in my specific subfield of Black liberation theological discourse to interpret spirit possession as an apolitical and otherworldly phenomenon. I cannot help but wonder, as a result of the emerging conversations among CSR scholars like Dr. Cohen, whether we might arrive at more robust theological interpretations of spirit possession and other African Atlantic religious experiences if we begin to consider how cognitive mechanisms affect theological sensibilities and moral intuition. Enough is certainly being said about the limits and even dangers of investing CSR research with the power to satisfy scholarly questions about lived religion and its meaning and consequences for individuals and societies in concrete situations. There is no need to summarize the compelling dimensions of a well-disposed social anthropologist's problems with the cognitive science of religion, literally the title of James Laidlaw's article in a 2007 anthology on religion, anthropology, and cognitive science that he and our esteemed co-chair of this session, Dr. Harvey Whitehouse, co-edited. As I move forward, I will certainly continue to take Laidlaw's caution seriously. However, I remain hopeful that new theories and constructive theologies will continue to emerge in religious studies, and particularly African and African Atlantic religious studies, that will demonstrate the value of placing cognitive and cultural approaches to religion in fruitful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stewart. Now, before we open this session up to questions from each of our two audiences, I'd like to give Dr. Cohen a few minutes to respond and to Professor Stewart's comments. And we're a couple minutes ahead, actually, so we've got some time. So, Dr. Cohen, take it away.
Thank you. It's at this point that I feel extremely constrained by my social cognition, because it's very difficult to address Professor Stewart by looking into the camera. But I'm going to try my best. I'm going to keep one eye, look at you out of the corner of my eye, Professor Stewart. But I really want to thank you. I really want to thank you for your response, and it's extremely encouraging. I like, you know, it's positive but also quite measured, and I think that could probably perhaps only come from someone who's had more than a brief dip into the cognitive science of religion. I think that sometimes when an approach is quite new, the people involved and people who are excited about it all can maybe try to oversell it a little bit. I don't think we're terribly guilty of that, but we might be sometimes misrepresented as doing so. But there's certainly our limits. It'll be a long time, if ever we reach, you know, conclusive statements about the cognitive underpinnings of religious cognition in all its variety cross-culturally. We'll never have comprehensive explanations of anything. And it'll be a long time before we can even have achieved some degree of certainty about some of the things that we're looking at. And so it's particularly encouraging to receive such a positive response when it's such early days. I think what's really striking actually is that you come from a theological background and I come from an anthropological background, and we have somehow ended up being bridged together, linked together in a way by cognitive science, even though we're both looking at very similar practices cross-culturally. I think that cognitive science allows disciplines to bridge in this way. And in particular, we here in Oxford are doing our best to bridge with theology in particular and religious studies, particularly in the Cognition, Religion and Theology project. And I think there's a lot of promise there. There's a lot of material, interpretive scholarship, very fine scholarship in anthropology as well, very detailed ethnographic data and so on. And it's been a long time since the bulk of anthropologists were really concerned to look at recurrences cross-culturally in the record and to devise ways of comparing like with like and so on, and then going on to explain why these things might arise. And so I'm particularly encouraged that you see some value in what's going on for your work, and in particular in these questions. I guess the main ambition of CSR, or Cognitive Science of Religion, is to explain things about the world, and sometimes we might arrive at more comprehensive understandings in a way of what's going on, but ultimately it requires getting at the causes of the phenomena that we observe, and quite often get at the causes of the phenomena we observe, we have to go via meanings. And by meanings I mean I could go to the field and observe possession as you did, and not really have a clue about what's going on. Like you said, I went there ready to hear whatever they had to say about it, because I really didn't know. I had no clues, even until I came back actually and started analysing the data, as to what might be cross-culturally recurrent about possession, and how the cognitive constraints might be implied in that. So I'm not sort of setting out to prove anything. I've asked some questions and found some quite interesting answers and patterns out there, but there's still a long way to go. So I guess that's one thing I would stress for the field in general, and in particular my work. It's very early days. I think that the research that you've raised some questions with me, and I think this is a discussion that we'll hopefully continue in the future, but particularly with the research that I reported on today, there are lots of limitations there. We found certain patterns, and we don't know precisely what the causal mechanisms are that underlie them. So, for example, you've asked me if the common concepts of multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder might influence people's notions in the UK context about the displacement model and so on, and why, and that might sort of give rise to their responses and their biases in these studies. There are lots of things we just don't know about that, and I think these are very much sort of next steps. So as Justin always tells me, and he's my I'm his trainee in cognitive psychology, so he always tells me you can't do everything with one study, and so it's cumulative theory building and cumulative data gathering, and eventually we get there. But I think we have to do it as a team, and I certainly don't attempt to burn bridges with the social sciences and the humanities as well in my foray into cognitive science. I just hope this is a discussion that we can continue. This is a bit rambly, I'm sorry, but I really appreciate your response. Thank you.
Thank you.